Chapter 10. Hedonic Engineering. So if the responsibility to democratize ecstasy falls squarely on us, we need to remember that we're no longer protected by the pale. We're out here on our own when it comes to exploring consciousness. As Sasha Shulgin used to say, there are no casual experiments. That's the goal of this final chapter. To provide a set of guidelines for training non-ordinary states and share a few key ideas from the research in this domain. We'll identify known dangers, places where the overzealous typically blow themselves up, and suggest a handful of solutions to the more common problems people encounter. Think of it as a user manual for ecstasy. Known issues of STER. At the end of the chapter on neurobiology, we introduced a potential upgrade for making sense of ecstasy, reproposing our egos from our operating system to a user interface. Making this switch can help us unburden our psychology and manage the intensity of a wider range of states without overclocking our processors. But when it comes to exploring those states, we still have to contend with a whole set of known issues. Call them the downsides of STER: exposure to the selflessness, timelessness, effortlessness, and richness of an ecstasy can go wrong, and wrong in predictable ways. For each of these experiences, there is a corresponding danger that, if we know about it ahead of time, we have a chance to avoid. Selflessness. It's not about you. You could call it a Messiah complex and you wouldn't be wrong. Certainly. The Messiahs come in droves, but so do Virgin Marys, King Davids, and at least one Samson, who proved his virility by smashing through a wall of the psychiatric hospital in Old Jerusalem. There are thousands of cases on record. Pilgrims who visit the city and get kicked out of reality by the weight of all that holy history, rather than deciding, "Wow, I just had a mystical experience where I felt like Jesus Christ." They conclude, "Wow, I am Jesus Christ." Clear the decks. People, I've got things to do. First identified back in the 1930s. 2 Jerusalem syndrome is a temporary fit of madness brought on by a visit to one of the world's most sacred sites. It's an overdose of spiritual awe, where historical significance and religious potency team up to overwhelm the unprepared. Occasionally, it afflicts people with pre-existing mental conditions. Mostly it hits people with devout religious beliefs. Every now and again, it fells average tourists. Psychologists call this reaction extreme ego inflation. Often, the experience of selflessness is so new and compelling that it feels like no one else has ever felt this way before, that it's evidence of some kind of sacred anointment. When triggered by an awe-inspiring encounter with the Wailing Wall, the result is Jerusalem syndrome. But the same thing can happen with any ecstatic experience. It's why Burning Man advises people to not make any life-changing decisions for at least a month following the event. 3. And why online psychedelic message boards like Arrowhead are filled with advice like "Don't believe everything you think." In non-ordinary states, dopamine often skyrockets, while activity in the prefrontal cortex plummets. Suddenly we're finding connections between ideas that we've never even thought of before. Some of those connections are legitimate insights. Others are flights of fancy. In 2009, Swiss neurologist Peter Brugger discovered that people with more dopamine in their systems are more likely to believe in secret conspiracies and alien abductions. They're suffering from apophenia, the tendency to be overwhelmed by meaningful coincidence, and detecting patterns where others see none. When the prefrontal cortex shuts down, impulse control, 5 long-term planning, and critical reasoning faculties go offline. 2. We lose our checks and balances. Combine that with excessive dopamine telling us that the connections we're making are radically important and must be immediately acted upon. That we're radically important and must be listened to, and it's not hard to imagine how this goes wrong. So no matter what comes up, no matter how fantastical your experience, it helps to remember it's not about you. Take an encounter with selflessness for all the possibility it suggests, but fold those lessons back into your everyday roles and responsibilities. As Buddhist teacher and author Jack Kornfield 6 reminds us, after the ecstasy, the laundry, timelessness. It's not about now. In 1806, General Zebulon Pike set out to survey the Rocky Mountains. When he crossed into Colorado and first sighted the 14,000-foot peak that would later bear his name, he wrote in his journal that he expected to camp on its summit in 3 days at most. 3 weeks later, Pike and a small band of his men gave up climbing in defeat. Pike, himself, failed to climb Pike's Peak, and for an understandable reason. Utterly unaccustomed to the thin air and high elevation, he'd badly misjudged the distance and the scale of the terrain he was exploring. A similar issue arises when we encounter the timelessness of non-ordinary states. Our ability to accurately estimate how close things are to happening, both in our life and in the world at large, can get seriously skewed. under normal conditions. With an active prefrontal cortex constantly scanning scenarios in the past and the future, we spend very little time living completely in the present. So when a non-ordinary state plunges us into the immediacy of the deep now, it brings an added sense of gravitas to the moment. Popular religious movements. From the Seventh-day Adventists 9 in the 1840s to Mayan calendar adherents in 2012 have all bet on putting a doomsday pin in the calendar. Contemporary psychonauts have even coined a term 10 for this persistent distortion. Eschatothesia, the perception of the Eschaton, or the end of the world. It is not necessarily the absolute end of times. The hyperspace lexicon clarifies, but can be a feeling of some huge event in the near future. We are approaching the end of an aeon, a marker in time after which nothing will be the same. And it's not just would-be prophets who suffer from this distortion. Anyone who experiences the clarity and immediacy of ecstasis and tries to bring those insights back to reality has to account for the time lag. A surfer who in a flow state drops into a wave and strings together a series of moves he's never pulled off before may need months of hard training to be able to reproduce them in a contest. An entrepreneur who glimpses a brilliant business model while dancing at a festival may need years to build the company that actually delivers on it. A musician who hears a fully formed symphony in her head during a meditation retreat could take the rest of her life to become skilled enough to actually play it, which is fine if we anticipate it, but demoralizing if we don't. Most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year. 11 Bill Gates once said, and underestimate what they can do in 10. In bringing back ecstatic insights, it's critical that we calibrate the difference between the reach out and touch it immediacy of the deep now with the frustratingly incremental unfolding of the day-to-day, as Zeeble and Pike learn it the hard way. At high elevations, objects in the mirror are sometimes much farther away than they appear. Remember, it's not about now. Effortlessness. Don't be a bliss junkie. With effortlessness, we see a different downside. The combination of all those reward neurochemicals and overflowing inspiration can be intoxicating. Once people taste the fleeting effortlessness of ecstasis, some decide that's how life is always supposed to be, a state of perpetual ease. They become bliss junkies. State chasers, refusing to do anything unless they can, to borrow a phrase, go with the flow. Think of yourself as a colander, a bowl filled with holes. When you experience a peak state, it's like turning on the kitchen faucet and flooding that colander with water. If there's enough volume, the colander fills up, despite the leaks. As long as water keeps flooding in, you will, for a moment, experience what it's like to be a cup. You'll feel whole. If you're really inspired, holy, then the faucet turns off. The peak experience ends, and all that water leaks back out. In a matter of moments, you'll settle back to where you started. The information recedes. The inspiration that was so easy to grasp moments ago slips away. And now you've got a decision to make. Do you engage the dull and repetitive work of plugging your leaks, or do you go hunting for the next ecstatic faucet to tap? The notion that hard work and persistence in the face of struggle might have a role in all of this often gets lost. In 2014, Ryan Holiday released a best-selling book 12 on exactly this subject, The Obstacle is the Way. It offered an update to the Roman Stoic Marcus Aurelius's claim that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. And this is certainly true of the ecstatic way. All that effortless effort takes a lot of work. So do the hard thing and the rest becomes much easier. Enjoy the state, but be sure to do the work. And no matter how tempting it is, don't become a bliss junkie. Richness. Don't dive too deep. On November 17, 2013, Nick Mavoli bet on himself 13-1 last time and lost. This was at Dean's Blue Hole, a nearly 700-foot deep patch of ocean in the Bahamas. Mavoli was a rising star in the free diving community, where divers swim as deep as they can with only a lungful of air. He had shot to prominence in the prior couple of years, winning contests, setting records, and finding solace in his life under the water. Water is acceptance of the unknown, of demons, of emotions, of letting go and allowing yourself to flow freely with it. He had written in his blog 14, come to the water willing to be consumed by it, but also have confidence that your ability will bring you back. That day, after barely resurfacing from a 72-meter warm-up dive into the Blue Hole, Mavoli went into cardiac arrest and died. This time, he wasn't able to bring himself back. When asked to comment on the accident, Natalia Molchanova, regarded by many as the greatest freehold breath diver in the world, said, the biggest problem with freedivers. Now they go to deep to fast 15 less than 2 years later. Off the coast of Spain, Molchanova took a quick recreational dive of her own. She deliberately ran though her usual set of breathing exercises, attached a light weight to her belt to help her descend, and swam downward, alone. It was supposed to be a head-clearing reset, But Molchanova didn't come back either. And that's the problem that freediving shares with many other state-shifting techniques. Return too soon, and you'll always wonder if you could have gone deeper. Go too far, and you might not make it back. When we go down, Molchanova had told an interviewer not long before her death, we understand we are whole. We are one with the world 16. That feeling is called the rapture of the deep. A euphoric high produced by alterations in the lungs' gaseous chemistry, and it's responsible for 1 in 10 of all dive fatalities. For those exploring non-ordinary states, there's a similar danger. You can stay down too long, amazed at what you're discovering. You also can become enraptured by the deep. And if Maverick and Molchanova are the cautionary tales of free diving, the poster child for ecstasy's gone too far is someone whose story we've come to know well, Dr. John Lilly. After abandoning his experiments at the National Institute of Mental Health, Lilly went deeper and deeper into his psychedelically fueled float tank research by precisely balancing the effects of ketamine and sensory deprivation. He was able to blast off into the furthest reaches of inner space, so he could maintain contact with the matrix-like reality he encountered there. Lilly started injecting himself with ketamine on an hourly basis, often for weeks at a time. On one occasion the tank was too warm, 17, but when he tried to get up and adjust the temperature, he fell back in and, immobilized by the ketamine, drowned. His wife, Toni, came into the lab to find her husband floating face down and blue. She revived him using the CPR technique she had learned while reading the National Enquirer only 2 days earlier. That wasn't enough to slow Lilly. The rapture of the deep kept calling. While ketamine is so benign it's routinely used as an anesthetic for children and pregnant women, it has an underground reputation as the heroin of psychedelics. As Lilly discovered, it's the utterly novel information it provides, not its chemistry, that's so addicting. Not long after that near-fatal drowning, he had another brush with death in the hospital. Lilly had a textbook NDE and, as he reported afterward, was visited by the same entities he'd been encountering in the float tank. They presented him with a choice: leave with them for good, or return to his body, heal, and focus on more worldly pursuits. Finally, Lilly got the message. He abandoned his psychedelic research and retired with his wife to Hawaii, where he lived to the ripe age of 84. There may not be another researcher who has dived as deeply into the mysteries of consciousness as John Lilly. He may just have been lucky, or, as he believed, had some help from other realms, but undoubtedly his rigorous training as a scientist, his insistence on preserving a critical and objective stance in the face of even the most outrageous experiences, saved his mind and possibly his life. After all this, Lilly came to one overarching conclusion: what one believes to be true is true or becomes true within certain limits to be found experientially and experimentally. These limits are further beliefs to be transcended in the province of the mind. There are no limits, if he was right. And there really are no limits to consciousness. Then the point is not to keep going until we find it all, but to come back before we've lost it all. Because it really doesn't matter what we find down there, out there, or up there, if we're unable to bring it back to solid ground. So take it all in, but hold it loosely, and most critically, don't dive too deep. This leaves us with 4 rules of thumb to carry into our exploration of these states. It's not about you and it's not about now. Help us balance ego inflation and time distortion. Well, don't become a bliss junkie. And don't dive too deep. Ensure that we don't get seduced by the sensations and information that arise in altered states. Are these the only known issues? Not even close. Check out any of the world's contemplative traditions or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and you'll find dozens more. But these 4 cautions tie directly to the 4 core qualities of altered states. STER. They're non-negotiable. If you put it in the ditch with one of these, you've got no one to blame but yourself. No sympathy for the devil. 18 Hunter S. Thompson once wrote, "Buy the ticket, take the ride. And if it occasionally gets a little heavier than what you had in mind, well, maybe chalk it off to forced consciousness expansion." The ecstasis equation. In skiing, the north face of the Aiguille du Midi, a 12,000-foot peak in Chamonix, France, is one of the ultimate challenges. If the north face isn't extreme skiing, then nothing is. 19 Hans Ludwig wrote in Powder magazine. Every one of its routes features thousands of feet of complex high-angle terrain with constant depth exposure, mandatory rappels, and a snowpack that sticks tenuously to the hanging shield of glacial ice crowning the peak. Despite centuries of ski mountaineering in the region, no one completed a descent until 1994. Then, in 2001, Kristen Ulmer decided to give it a try. Known as one of the best multisport athletes in the world, Ulmer was an extraordinarily talented big mountain skier, ski mountaineer, rock climber, ice climber, and paraglider, with a level of dominance not often seen in any sport. She was named Best Female Extreme Skier in the world 12 years in a row. Of course, she wanted to become one of the first women to ski the North Face, 2 nights before Ulmer's descent. 4 feet of snow fell. The next morning she got a late start. As the sun climbed, the snow started to soften and slide. We got pinned on a 70-degree face. 20 standing on a 1-inch band of ice, while 7-story avalanches poured over our backpacks for 3 hours. When it was over, they sent a crew in by helicopter to retrieve our bodies. They were pretty shocked to find us alive. I was pretty shocked to be alive. This would have been a wake-up call for many. But Ulmer couldn't live without the rush. Whenever I felt that level of fear, that's when I felt the most alive. I was totally in the zone, and I was addicted to that feeling. I couldn't quit. So she didn't. She went skiing the next day. And again almost died. That was followed by 3 more near-death experiences. She explains, I had 5 in 5 months. It was pretty clear the universe was screaming at me to stop doing what I was doing. And I thought, being as nice about it as possible, but being a pro athlete was my salvation. My identity and my career. I had put decades of work into it. Quitting just seemed ridiculous. Then, in the middle of her crisis, Ulmer went to Burning Man for the first time. I was blown away. I got the exact same feeling I got from sports. I got it from the interactive art. I got it from the group flow. And that was it. I quit my career cold turkey and walked away from everything. Or, as Ski Journal once explained, in the 1990s, Kristen Ulmer blew up the freeski scene as the first true female extreme skier. Then she disappeared. Ulmer had realized that ecstasies can be accessed through a host of different pursuits. And that realization, as she says, saved my life. Since making this discovery, she has designed and built some of Burning Man's most famous art cars. She also trained as a meditation and performance coach, and now leads Zen ski camps. She hasn't had to risk her life for a thrill in years. I still measure the quality of my life by the number of times I get into the zone. Explains Ulmer, if I spend 2 weeks at Burning Man and only get that experience a handful of times, then I feel cheated. It wasn't worth it. But now I can try different things. That's the real change. Now I know I have options. That there are actual comparisons to make. Knowing there are options matters to plenty of people besides Ulmer. SEALs speak quietly of this same dilemma. Of how hard it is to flip the switch when they come off deployment. We hear similar accounts in action sports meccas like Squaw Valley and Jackson Hole. Consistently we're approached by athletes and their loved ones looking for ways to take fewer risks. Yet, like Ulmer and Chamonix, they haven't figured out any other way to feel quite as alive. Invariably, in those same conversations, someone always asks, but what's the best way to get into the zone? To which we respond, it depends. It depends on your tolerance for risk and how far over the edge you're willing to hang. It depends on your sense of urgency and whether your goals can be reached in minutes or decades. And it depends on how reliably your preferred approach delivers actionable information and insight. Those 3 parameters, risk, reward, and time, provide a way to compare non-ordinary states. This sliding scale lets you assess otherwise unrelated methods. From meditation to psychedelics to action sports to any others you can think of. And you can distill these variables into an equation. Value equals time times reward. Risk. In this equation, time refers to the learning curve, or how long you need to invest in a particular technique until it can reliably produce the experience of STER. Reward refers to how well we retain the insights that arise and how consistently they drive positive change. Risk refers to the potential dangers. If there's a chance that you could lose your life or your mind, that's something to consider well in advance. Put them all together, and you get an approximate value for each pursuit. This calculus is reflected in the different treatments for PTSD we examined in the chapter on psychology. A 1-day session with MDMA produces a marked decrease or abatement in symptoms. But you have to be willing to ingest an amphetamine to experience it. 5 weeks of surfing, potentially less risky than a drug intervention, achieves a similar result, but entails learning a new sport in an unfamiliar and sometimes dangerous environment. Meanwhile, meditation, both simpler and safer than surfing, requires 12 weeks and offers a slightly lessened benefit. These 3 approaches produce a similar reward, but they come with varying degrees of risk and investment of time. How you rank each variable is highly subjective, dependent on your abilities, responsibilities, and ambitions. But the final analysis is simple. Are any of these pursuits worth the time, effort, and money we invest in them? Are we more energetic, empathetic, and ethical afterward. If not, they're just distractions or diversions from our lives. I care not a whit for a man's religion. Abraham Lincoln once quipped, unless his dog is the better for it. And that goes double for techniques of ecstasy. Hedonic Calendaring. In 1991, RISE, the Associates for Research into the Science of Enjoyment, an organization that included representatives from the largest food and tobacco companies in the world, gathered in Venice, Italy. The meeting was dedicated to resisting Calvinistic attacks 21 on people who are obtaining pleasure without harming others. The topic of discussion, the Bliss Point. The Bliss Point. As Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Michael Moss describes in his book Salt, Sugar, Fat, is the precise amount of sweetness, no more, no less, that makes food and drink most enjoyable. And not surprisingly, Arise was deeply interested in hacking the Bliss Point, were the 3 pillars of processed food. The creators of Crave, Moss explains, they were also the ingredients that more than any other were directly responsible for the obesity epidemic. Salt, which was processed in dozens of ways to maximize the jolt that taste buds would feel with the very first bite, the fats, which delivered the biggest load of calories, and worked more subtly in inducing people to overeat, and the sugar, whose raw power in exciting the brain made it perhaps the most formidable ingredient of all, for virtually all of evolutionary history. Salts, sugars, and fats were rare and precious. The only time we encountered sweetness was in the few weeks of berry season or the lucky find of a honeycomb. The phrase "worth his salt" refers to the days of Rome, when soldiers were paid in this essential mineral, and fat, concentrated, delicious calories, was only available in nuts, oils, and meats. This is why, when we encounter a bacon cheeseburger sandwich between 2 Krispy Kreme donuts, we lose our minds. In the quarter century since that Venice meeting, the food industry has become so good at manipulating these evolutionary impulses that we've eaten ourselves into a coma. According to the National Institutes of Health, 74% of American men and 33% of children are now overweight or obese. Our Bliss Point got hacked, and it's killing us. Yet salt, sugar, fat provide a fraction of the payoff of ecstasy. In that state, we get access to all the brain's feel-good neurochemistry at once. For most of evolutionary history, non-ordinary states were rare and precious experiences. So when we consider how readily accessible the 4 forces are making them today, it's important to remember that we're tinkering with impulses that are millions of years old. If the desire to get out of our heads is, as UCLA's Ron Siegel suggests, 20 to a 4th evolutionary drive, right after food, water, and sex, then nearly unlimited access to ecstasy needs some checks and balances of its own. Otherwise, our Bliss Point can become the flashpoint for a meltdown. So how to pursue this path without getting hooked on the high? If we use the ecstasy equation to help us answer the question, what is the best way to get into the zone? Then we need to add an additional concept here, hedonic calendaring, which helps us figure out how often we should get into the zone. Hedonic calendaring provides a way to hack the ecstatic path without coming undone. It gives us a method to integrate hard and fast approaches like extreme skiing and psychedelics with slow and steady paths like meditation and yoga. It's one way to turn ecstasy into a sustainable long-term practice. And for anyone interested, there's a free downloadable hedonic calendaring PDF at www.stalangfirebOOK.com/download/. Step 1. List everything you love to do that gets you out of your head. Action sports, yoga, live music, sex, brain stimulation, meditation, personal growth workshops, adventure travel, etc. This may seem simple, but if you consider the breadth of the altered states economy and the fact that we tend to compartmentalize the many different ways we modulate consciousness, putting it all down in one place can lend some fresh perspective. Step 2. Use the ecstasy equation to rank this list for value. Think daily sun salutations versus an annual ultramarathon, or a 10-minute meditation versus a trip to see a Peruvian shaman. Step 3. Sort your activities into one of 5 buckets: daily, weekly, monthly, seasonally, and annually. More intense experiences typically provide more information, but they do so at a higher level of risk. So it makes sense to allow plenty of time for recovery and integration between those sessions while committing to more frequent supportive practices. How will you know if you've put the right activities in the right place? You'll feel mildly disappointed by how often you get to deploy a particular technique. When you deliberately combine ecstatic practices, you generate momentum surprisingly quickly, and it's easy to feel like you're getting out of control. It's far better to start a little slowly, then skid off the track in turn 1. Step 4. Research shows we're more likely to keep habits 23 that are tied to cultural milestones. So connecting practices to pre-existing traditions can make them easier to stick to. Daily, Link it to sunrise or sunset, dinners or bedtime. Weekly, make it your own contemporary TGIF or Sabbath observance. Monthly, connect it to the lunar cycle or the first or last days of the calendar. Seasonal, solstices, equinoxes, Christmas, Easter, July 4th, and Halloween all work and often come with vacation days attached. Annual, take your pick. Birthdays, anniversaries, New Year's, back to school, whatever's significant to you. For the daily practices, you're trying to create self-propelling rituals so you will do them often enough to build a solid foundation. By hitching them to constant time slots and locations, you automate your positive behavior without having to draw down limited supplies of willpower. For the stickier weekly, monthly, and annual practices, you're putting in buffers to ensure you don't do them too much. Step 5. Lastly, remember you're playing with addictive neurochemistry and deeply rooted evolutionary drivers. So, as your practices start building momentum, how do you know if you're pursuing a deliberate path or becoming a bliss junkie? Short answer, you don't. Long answer, once a year, set your indulgences up on a shelf, go 30 days cold turkey, and use this time to recalibrate. Attach the hiatus to traditional seasons of forbearance. Lent, Yom Kippur, Ramadan, or impose your own. When you return to your practices, you've got perspective on how sticky things can get and more feedback to fine-tune your calendar. Simply move any problematic activity to the right. If daily was too much, do it weekly. If quarterly practice leaves you wobbly, make it an annual event. Trade the morality of should I or shouldn't I for the logic of more often or less often. Altered states are in information technology, and what you're after is quality data. If you spend all of your time blissed out, zenned out, drunk, stoned, sexed up, or anything else, then you've lost all the contrast that initially made those experiences so rich, what made them altered in the first place. By balancing inebriated abandon with monk-like sobriety, ribald sexuality with introspective celibacy, and extreme risk-taking with cozy domesticity, you'll create more contrast and spot patterns sooner. The road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. 24 William Blake once wrote, Hedonic calendaring adds guardrails to that road by dismantling the oughts and shoulds of the orthodox approach. While avoiding the pitfalls of if it feels good, do it sensation-seeking, we up the odds of getting to our destination in one piece. There is a crack in everything. If we can remember the known issues of STER, use the ecstasis equation to balance risk and reward, and deploy the hedonic calendar to avoid overheating, we should be good to go, right? Maybe. There's one final caveat worth keeping in mind. Namely, there's no escaping the human condition. We're born, we die, and figuring out the in-between can be brutal. As Hemingway reminds us, 25 The world breaks everyone. Yet so many ecstatic traditions have promised to repeal that fundamental law. If we can only unlock the secret, they say, we will have everything we want without any of the suffering. Ironically, the attempt to avoid suffering often creates more of it, leaving us susceptible to the most predictable trap of all: spiritual bypassing, a widespread tendency to use spiritual ideas and practices. 26 says John Wellwood, the psychologist who coined the term, to sidestep or avoid facing unresolved emotional issues, psychological wounds, and unfinished developmental tasks. Typically, what gets bypassed on an ecstatic path are the mundane dissatisfactions of regular life. If those dissatisfactions are too intense, non-ordinary states can offer a tempting escape. But rather than bypassing these challenges, we can accept them and even draw power from them. This response has a paradoxical name: vulnerable strength. Brené Brown, whose books and TED Talks on the subject have resonated with massive audiences, explains it this way: embracing our vulnerabilities is risky but not nearly as dangerous as giving 27 up on love and belonging and joy. The experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. Balancing the bright lights of the ecstatic path with the darkness of the human condition is essential. Otherwise, we become unstable, top-heavy, our roots too shallow to ground us. The Indian philosopher Nisargadatta summed up the dilemma well. Love tells me I am everything. Wisdom tells me I am nothing. 28 In between these two banks flows the river of my life. If we map this idea onto what we know about non-ordinary states, then Nisargadatta's everything. Nothing dialectic isn't just flowery wisdom, it's the byproduct of the neurobiology of ecstasis itself. The love that tells me I am everything arises from the awe and connection that we often experience in these states. Endorphins, oxytocin, and serotonin soothe our vigilance centers. We feel strong, safe, and secure. It's a welcome relief and healing for those who don't often get to feel that way. The wisdom that tells me I am nothing springs from the information richness. Dopamine, anandamide, and norepinephrine turn the bitstream of consciousness into a flood. Critical filters are down. Pattern recognition is up. We make connections faster than we normally do. But within all that wisdom, there's a common tendency to be confronted by the hard truths we've been trying to ignore. Is absolutely ruthless and highly indifferent, 29, wrote John Lilly. It teaches its lessons whether you like them or not. Every glimpse above the clouds can't help but suggest work still to be done on the ground. That's the resolution to the paradox of vulnerable strength. Ecstasy doesn't absolve us of our humanity. It connects us to it. It's in our brokenness, not in spite of our brokenness, that we discover what's possible. The Japanese get at this same idea with the concept of wabi-sabi 30, or the ability to find beauty in imperfection. If a vase is accidentally broken, for example, they don't throw the pieces away or try to patch it up to hide the accident. Instead, they take golden glue and painstakingly reassemble the vessel so its unique flaws make the piece more beautiful. The late poet and musician Leonard Cohen may have been our greatest contemporary commentator on this theme. In his song Anthem, he sings, "Ring the bells that still can ring, 31, forget your perfect offering." There is a crack in everything. It's where the light gets in. The ecstasy will always come with the agony. That's the human condition. Nothing we do absolves us from the open beauty of that journey. So there will be cracks. Thankfully, there will always be cracks. Because, as Cohen reminds us, that's where the light gets in.